Thank you for joining us today. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor of political science and international and public affairs, and I currently serve as provost of Brown University. And I'm very pleased to be able to co-sponsor the Race and in America series with Professor Tricia Rose and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, one of our key centers here at Brown. Through this series, we seek to advance our very mission as a university by highlighting the important and highly impactful research and expertise of our faculty. And you'll be meeting some of our faculty later today. Now, the role of race in America and the impact of racism on individuals, communities, impacts our progress as a nation. We've seen this unfold for centuries, and most vividly in recent months. This series offers 8 opportunities over the course of the entire academic year to gain deeper understanding of just some of the interconnected threads that make up systemic racism. Guided by exceptional scholars, we've been able to learn, to question and refine ideas, and to sharpen our perspectives on race and racism in America. That's what universities should be doing. And I'm very proud that Brown is engaged in this process. Today's exploration about the role of race in the exercise of democracy is especially timely given the recent election. Since this nation's founding, we've been at odds with a constitution that is both lofty and aspirational, while also disenfranchising the rights of entire groups of citizens simply based on their race. It has taken the hard-fought struggles and battles of so many to secure the rights we associate with democracy, a system of government that is envisioned as by the people and for the people. Yet despite centuries of struggle with Reconstruction, the passage of both the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, the Black Lives Matter movement, we're still not there as a country. And as we witnessed in this most recent election, deliberate efforts continue to persist to suppress the vote of Black people and other marginalized communities in our country. So today, guided by our exceptional panel of Brown University faculty, we can sort of delve into a little more deeply this topic to better understand its roots, its consequences, and maybe even some remedies. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to be with us today. And I want to give special thanks to my friend and colleague, Bonnie Honig, who is the Nancy Duke Lewis Professor of Modern Culture and Media and Political Science here at Brown. Bonnie is an acclaimed political theorist. Her areas of expertise span gender studies, feminist theory, and the politics of civil disobedience. She is the author of numerous books, including Public Things, Democracy in Disrepair.
I want to thank Provost Locke for introducing us to the series. It's a pleasure to be with you and with my distinguished colleagues and friends, Juliette Hooker, Melvin Rogers, and Andre Willis from the Departments of Political Science and Religious Studies for today's session on race and democracy. Each of our panelists will speak for 10 minutes. Then we're going to open the panel for questions and discussions. I may have a question, the panelists may have questions for one another, but we'll provide ample time for audience questions as well. If you want to take part with a question or a comment, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We will try to get to as many as possible. So, why have we made time in our very busy Decembers for today's event? On every front, the most pressing political questions of our day press us to attend to race. The asymmetries of COVID's impact, the ongoing sacrifice of frontline and essential workers during the pandemic, the sharpened vulnerability of minority communities to eviction, debt, and bankruptcy, and the ongoing efforts to disenfranchise Black voters and majority Black cities, while also over-policing Black neighborhoods and Black life. All of these press on us an urgent question. Is the system broken, or is it working exactly as intended? And either way, what will it take to empower communities, to enact accountability, and fully democratize our institutions, our culture, and our way of life? So that's a full plate of things to discuss. I'm now going to briefly introduce our panelists in the order that they'll speak, and you'll also find a link to longer biographies of each one in the chat. Our first speaker is Professor of Political Science, Juliette Hooker. Professor Hooker is a political theorist who's published 2 books and many articles on race and multiculturalism, on Frederick Douglass, and on Afro-descendant and indigenous rights in Latin America. She's currently working on a new book called Black Grief, White Grievance, on the role of loss in contemporary racial politics in the US. Next up will be Associate Professor of Political Science, Melvin Rogers, also a political theorist, who's published a book and many articles on Dewey, Walker, Du Bois, and more. In addition, Rogers is co-editor of the ambitious African-American Political Thought, A Collected History, out recently with University of Chicago Press. And he's now completing a new book called The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African-American Political Thought. Finally, we will hear from Andre Willis, Associate Professor of Religious Studies, who has published numerous articles on theology, also on Dewey, the Enlightenment, and race, ranging from the Scottish philosopher David Hume to Obama. He has a book on Hume as well, called Towards a Humean True Religion, and he's currently working on a new project on African-American religion and politics and the idea of post-democracy. So we'll turn first now to Professor Hooker.
Thank you very much to Provost Locke and to Tricia Rose for inviting me to be a part of this panel with my distinguished colleagues, and to Bonnie Honig for that wonderful introduction. As I was preparing my remarks for this panel today on the health of US democracy, a kernel in a news story about the current Senate runoff elections in Georgia perfectly encapsulated the perils and contradictions vis-a-vis race that have always been at the heart of how democratic politics has been conceived and practiced in the United States. The Secretary of State of Georgia, a Republican who has been under enormous pressure from members of his party to endorse false claims of widespread fraud, and who has been lionized alongside other local and state level Republican officials who have withstood similar pressures in Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Pennsylvania for their defense of democratic norms, announced plans to investigate third-party groups, such as the New Georgia Project, a voter registration group founded by Stacey Abrams, that seek to counter years of systemic disenfranchisement in Georgia by means of restricted voter ID laws, purging of voter rolls, etc. And these efforts have been credited with playing a major role in breaking down barriers to participation and increasing voter engagement and turnout, i.e., these organizations have been doing the grunt work of democracy. Abrams's pivotal voter rights activism in Georgia after her own narrow election loss in 2018 was captured in a 2019 Vogue profile entitled, "Can Stacey Abrams Save American Democracy?" It is not accidental that completely unfounded claims of voter fraud have been focused on majority Black cities and counties, and that voter registration efforts led by Black women, and that even those elected officials unwilling to outright steal an election, which would require throwing out millions of legally cast votes by white and non-white citizens alike, are nevertheless entirely willing to bow to partisan anger by demonizing Black voters and representing their political participation as somehow always illegitimate and suspect. We see a related version of this problem in the arguments of centrist Democrats that calls by Black activists to defund the police were the cause of their down ballot losses, as if this were a question of electoral strategy rather than an urgent moral and political demand to ensure that Black lives matter. As these examples show, who is seen as legitimately capable of wielding political power in the US has always been shaped by race, and it continues to be so to this day. Racism, as the political scientist Michael Hanchard has argued, is indeed the specter that haunts democracy in the US and elsewhere. As Hanchard noted, even what we consider to be the most advanced liberal democracies in the world, those against which other countries' progress towards democracy is measured, have always been, at best, only partial and uneven democracies that have always been sharply delimited by race. In light of this, I want to approach my reflections on race and the status of US democracy by adding a third term to the equation, mourning. In this vein, I think the questions that we have been asked to reflect on today about race and the health of US democracy, is it broken? Or is it working exactly as intended? Is it salvageable? Which are excellent and indeed pressing questions, by the way, belong to a genre that we might call democracy grief. The breakdowns of what were previously perceived by many as unassailable norms of US political life during the Trump presidency provoked an outpouring of democracy grief. The longstanding scholarship in comparative politics on democratic deficits and democratic breakdown no longer applied only to countries in the global South. Instead, the question of how democracies die has become frighteningly relevant for the United States. As described in the New York Times, this form of political suffering or civic sadness emerged from being confronted for the first time with the reality that the US is a democracy in need of repair. And I'm quoting now from the column. For anyone who was like me, born after the Civil Rights Movement finally made democracy in America real, liberal democracy has always been part of the climate, easy to take for granted. When I contemplate this sort of illiberal oligarchy that is no longer unthinkable in the US, the scale of the loss feels so vast that I can barely process it, end quote. Yet this kind of grieving for democracy is only a new experience for some. For Black citizens and other people of color suffering from a racist criminal justice system and mass incarceration policies that demonize them and routinely subject them to lethal police violence for the most imagined infractions, and who also suffer the psychic tax of knowing that the political leadership of their country is complicit in perpetuating these harms and that many of their ordinary fellow citizens are intensely invested in denying that such injustices even exist, being dehumanized and treated as an internal enemy by the state whose role is ostensibly to protect its citizens is nothing new. Moreover, for Black people within the US body politic, democracy grief and dying for democracy have long been intertwined. Not only have they not received the same level of concern from the state as other citizens, they are continually asked to sacrifice for democracy. Voter suppression tactics, for instance, have long meant that minority voters must stand in line for hours to vote, as some Black Georgians had to do for up to 8 hours, and racial gerrymandering has diluted their political power. Black citizens are thus sacrificing to participate in a political community that not only does not protect them, but which is fundamentally not committed to their survival, much less their thriving. In my view, then, the answer to the question of whether US democracy is broken or is merely function as intended is that it has always been broken for some. We have never had a genuine multiracial democracy whose mortal illness we can now all mourn. What we're seeing today is that the racist democratic deficits that have been present since the founding are seeping in and eroding white democracy as well. This brings me to the third question that we were asked to reflect on: is US democracy salvageable? Here, I think it is important to reflect on what salvaging or repairing democracy entails. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, defines repair as, quote, to restore a damaged, worn, or faulty object or structure to good or proper condition by replacing or fixing parts, to mend, fix. It defines salvaging, meanwhile, as, quote, to save from shipwreck, fire, etc., to make use of unattended property, to save and collect waste material for recycling, and finally, a proposed draft edition drawn from Philippine English supplies the following meaning, quote, to apprehend and execute a suspected criminal without trial. That is, people are salvaged is the usage. Based on these contrasting accounts, salvaging thus seems the more capacious of the two terms, and one that is perhaps more suited to the complex task of rethinking, remaking, or building from scratch a truly egalitarian democracy where one has not really existed. Whereas repair assumes a baseline soundness of the thing being fixed, which requires only alterations to some of its parts. The distinction between salvaging and repairing democracy is reminiscent of the distinction between frameworks of justice that envision reparations for the harms of slavery and Christina Sharpe's notion of living in the wake, where she uses the wake as a metaphor with multiple meanings applicable to Black life in the aftermath of slavery, as a mourning ritual, as the disturbances that follow, movement of air and water, such as that of the slave ship. Political theorists who advocate reparations for slavery generally base their claims on the idea that in order to be just, a society must seek to repair the wrongs it has committed. Thomas McCarthy, for example, has argued that redressing past wrongs is essential to establishing conditions of justice in a society scarred by the enduring and pervasive effects of those wrongs. Advocates of reparations nonetheless acknowledge that these measures cannot repair the immeasurable systemic and long-lasting effects of slavery, a caveat that is the point of departure for Christina Sharpe's meditations on living in the wake. Sharpe argues that the ongoing disaster of Black death requires not seeking redress from the state, because you can't repair an ongoing harm. And moreover, how could you even begin to repair the kinds of losses that are the result of an anti-Blackness that requires Black death, i.e. living in the wake? Instead, she argues for what she calls wake work, attending to the dead, tending to the Black dead and living, performing the work of caring Black communities that is central to Black survival. Sharpe's metaphor of living in the wake of the slave ship might thus be open to the work of salvaging, not the ship, but the communities built from its timbers. Democratic theorists and citizens then are too often seduced by romantic narratives about what democratic politics entails, setting aside the anxieties and alienations of democratic life. We also elevate sacrifices for democracy, framing them in a reparative vein that has a paradoxical effect of minimizing ongoing and continuing loss. This leads us to mistakenly laud democratic sacrifice as a symptom, not of civic health, as a symptom of civic health rather than of democratic decay and domination. So what can thinking about race, democracy, and mourning tell us about how to envision and fight for systemic change that will enhance accountability? One, I think it tells us to be vigilant and wary of another lost cause. When 2020, that 2020 might become an emblematic instance of white loss, which as was the case for white Southerners after the Civil War, fueled an even greater commitment to white minority rule and Black subordination. Second, I think we also have to not make Black people the mules of white democracy. What do I mean by this? This means not simply honoring and recognizing the essential civic labor and sacrifices on behalf of democracy of Black and Latinx and Indigenous, et cetera, activists. It also means becoming comfortable with their leadership and political ideas. And in this vein, I think we also have to realize that Black freedom dreams should not be constrained by the limits of democratic repair, that these are not one and the same project, and that we need to not constrain one by envisioning it as coterminous with the other. I think it also means that we need to move past the fetishism of certain US institutions, right? A myth of sclerotic constitutionalism as the bulwark of US democracy. We need to be open to transforming current institutions, tearing them down, building them anew, things like the Electoral College, lifetime judges, the way we have structured policing, institutions that don't work in the current moment and that are serving to entrench minority rule and actually not enhancing democracy. I also think in this vein, because I know the response to this is going to be, how do we do this given the current configuration in the countries, to say that we need to not be afraid to dream and imagine differently. All the great movements for social justice in this country, if you think about the abolition of slavery or the struggle for civil rights in the 1960s, have been met with resistance. They did not come about at a time when there was suddenly universal support for their policies. In 1963, for example, Martin Luther King, who now has 95% approval ratings, was viewed favorably by only 41% compared to 37% of respondents in a poll who viewed him unfavorably. And more respondents viewed him highly unfavorably, 25%, than highly favorably, only 16%. The issue then, when we think about the question of race and US democracy, is that racial justice is always untimely. And therefore, democracy grief has been intertwined. Mourning for democracy has always been integral to the experience of democratic politics in the United States for many of its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliette Hooker. And now we will turn to Professor Rogers to speak next.
Thank you, Bonnie. Juliet, thank you for that very sort of powerful meditation and analysis. I'm very delighted and will always be honored by the opportunity to gather with all of you to discuss important matters. We find ourselves gathered today, all of us, I imagine, yet again to talk about race and democracy, the sort of messy and painful drama of this country. So let me begin with two ground clearing points. So first, what I'm concerned with here today is racial inequality and democracy. And what I have in the background of my thinking when I say racial inequality is a culture, and here I'm referring to the United States, is a culture that devalues Black and brown lives when compared to white lives. And this cultural devaluation shows itself in our relationship to our Black and brown brothers and sisters. This cultural devaluation also shows itself in the political and economic opportunities that do and do not exist for Black and brown people in this country. Now, I want to be very clear before I lose people on this. I do not mean that every white person is living a wonderful life and every Black and brown person is living a horrible life. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I mean is that patterns of treatment, economic and political opportunities reveal that Black and brown people more often than not are at a disadvantage when compared to their white counterparts in this society. And more often than not, what I mean is that we are not very much concerned about this fact, or perhaps to be generous, we're not concerned about it in the right kind of way. The second point I want to make is that, as a ground clearing point, is that, look, we always invoke the term democracy, but it is not always clear what we mean by it, and it most certainly isn't clear at all that we have ever lived it. So when I say democracy, I do not exclusively mean the electoral system of representative government that we're familiar with, that we find ourselves living in this country, and that everyone has most recently said held up during the most recent election. So I mean something that should run deeper, and something that should run deeper and should shape our civic identity when I use the word democracy. I mean democracy is a set of beliefs and habits, belief, for example, in the equal dignity of persons, belief that each of us should be free to flourish without fear, or without fear of threat, or fear of arbitrary violence, and belief that each of us is worthy of proper care and concern by the society to which we belong. Now, democracy in this sense, in this very important sense, is not merely about our political institutions, but is a way of life, a way of relating to our fellows. So these are the 2 points in the background. What I would like to do for the remainder of my time is talk about 2 ways of seeing or perceiving racial inequality and democracy in this country. And I begin here because I think how we see or imagine our problems matter a great deal for what we believe is possible in responding to those problems. And I want to suggest that we historically in this present moment, we have a way of moving back and forth between seeing racial inequality and democracy either in terms of a tragedy or in terms of a romance. And I want to also suggest to you that neither of these positions is compatible with living in a healthy democratic society or aspiring to live in one, a society that should aim to respond to the grievances of its members. So I won't have any solutions. And I know we always want solutions, but I won't have any solutions for you today. And this will in part be an intellectual enterprise. But I think it will provide a way of understanding the landscape of racial inequality and democracy and bringing into view a set of questions at the end that might sort of orient us going forward. So given the history of racial inequality in this country, one might reasonably ask, what is it about this society that justifies the fate of African Americans? Here I focus more narrowly. What justifies their sustained commitment to this society? I mean, you might think, given how frequently the police kill African Americans, past and present, given their experiences of economic inequality, past and present, I mean, given the general sense that from city to city and state to state, Black people are subject to a form of insecurity unrivaled by their white counterparts, you might think commitment isn't justified at all. It may seem appropriate to interpret the United States as working according to plan. And you might think further that it is reasonable to connect the horror of the earliest periods of African American life in this country, slavery, domination, Jim and Jane Crow. You might think it appropriate to connect that horror of the past to the present moment. And when you connect the earliest periods to our present moment, it may appear that the United States has a sustained commitment to what we might call anti-Blackness. Writing, for example, in response to the killing of African-American teen Trayvon Martin in 2012 and to the acquittal of George Zimmerman the following year, journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates described the entire set of events as the natural result of our society functioning as intended. This is how he put it, quote, "It is painful to say this. Trayvon Martin is not a miscarriage of justice, but American justice itself. This is not our system malfunctioning. It is our system working as intended," end quote. Now, Coates is a popular version of this view, but it has a long, long history going back at least to the great Black nationalist Martin Delaney of the 1850s. And it leads some in our present moment to say things like, quote, "Blackness is coterminous with slaveness," end quote. Or Black is not an arc at all, but a flat line, historical stillness, end quote. Now, behind these elusive philosophical lines is a basic point. To be Black in this country is always to be seen as vulnerable to arbitrary power and violence, and to be treated as something that can be abused without fear or punishment. Right? This is not the only story we tell ourselves about the relationship between racial inequality and democracy. There is another, more familiar one. This too is also an old story. You find versions of it in the great French visitor to the United States, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America in the 1850s. You find it in the great work, The American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal of the 1940s. And you hear it, even if faintly, in William Julius Wilson's important work of 1978, the declining significance of race. And you get it from the American conservative politician William Bennett, who, after the election of Barack Obama in 2008, said on CNN, to the question of what does this election mean, this is what Bennett said, it means now Blacks have no more excuses. What you hear in various ways is that racial inequality was always an anomaly in the United States, and that progress and development are working to better align our practices with our deep beliefs. Yes, the United States has problems when it comes to race, but its unfolding story, or so this is how it goes, its unfolding story means that we are improving. You know, the first story seems far more compelling these days, and the second, not so much. But there were other times when the second story seemed far more compelling than the first. And I see the allure of both, perhaps you do as well. And even as I understand the allure of both, they each rely on what Hayden White classically called a meta-historical framework. What did he mean by that? Well, he meant that expectations and predictions are built into the framework of the narrative you tell. Either the past of racial inequality, is allowed to determine the present and future, or the past is disconnected from the true meaning of the present and future. You see, the first approach leads to a tragedy from which we cannot escape. And the second approach, in which the past has no bearing on who we really are, leads to romantic ideas of progress and overcoming. These two approaches, and I'll conclude on this point, these two approaches often make a great deal of trouble with living up to the demands of a democratic society, a society that aspires to show, or should aspire to show, care and concern for its citizens. The tragic view of racial inequality means that what we do in response to racial inequality will have no bearing on the life chances of Black people in this country, and will have no effect on reconfiguring the culture in which we live, a culture of devaluation. It says to us that there are no resources on which we can rely to help us reweave or remake the society in which we live and remake it in the service of racial justice. See, but the romantic view, in its rush to embrace the truth of progress, it finds itself explaining away the persistence of racial inequality. It must be something, it is often said, that Black people are doing rather than what is being done to them. Perhaps they lack drive or character, or perhaps they live the wrong kind of culture. And in its quest to embrace progress, it fails to show proper care and concern as demanded by democracy in the first place. If the first posture seems unsatisfying because it denies human agency and gives the past too much power over the present and the future, the second risks ignoring the ways white supremacy is bolstered by institutional support and state-sanctioned violence that emanate from a culture that disregards Black people. Now, I said I have no solutions, just a way of seeing things. Is there a different way of seeing racial inequality and democracy beyond these two approaches? Is there a way of remaining committed to improvement and development amid the history of Black pain and the sense of betrayal? What does it mean to live with the horror of one's past without the illusions that progress talk consistently invite? Those seem to me the questions that should orient us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll be thinking with you and with Juliette Hooker about democracy without illusions as we go forward. And we'll turn now finally to Professor Andre Willis.
Yes, thanks, Bonnie, and thank you to Marissa Quinn, Provost Locke, Meg Silvestri, and Hannah, who are on this call helping us out with the technology. Of course, my wonderful colleague, Melvin, and Juliet, and the staff at CSREA, Soraya, Trey, Stephanie, and Caitlin. I want to start by acknowledging, I guess, the families that are suffering right now. There's so much sadness and sorrow in the world these days, and I just don't think anybody's really operating right now from 100%. So as I say that though, I guess I'm thinking about the conditions of despair that have for so long been haunting Black communities, communities that have been under siege, you know. We have these persistent attacks on Black communities, and we see these attacks resulting in high levels of poverty, low levels of education, disproportionate levels of incarceration, and all kind of environmental catastrophes that have become sort of endemic to many of these communities. And I feel like when we think about race and democracy, right, it's important to start with the perpetual assaults on Black communities. And that leads me to my premise for today, which is that African Americans can no longer afford to think of US liberal constitutional democracy as a reliable resource to help us build the communities that will enable and sustain our flourishing. So I guess with this kind of claim, I'm in solidarity with the 91-year-old Du Bois, who, as he was stepping off to Ghana for the last time, wrote in a letter, and I'm quoting, "In America, the Negro cannot win," end quote. And I think of this letter less as a kind of Du Boisian resignation, right? Him being tired and exhausted and willing to kind of let the ship go down as he stepped off of it, but more as a kind of idea that, you know, these structures of the American society are fundamentally stacked against Black communities, right? So today I want to share like 2 points that my premise generates, right? The first, and this is where I will spend most of my 10 minutes, concerns the hypervalorization of democracy. The second is about just a few minutes on the merits of the notion post-democracy. I'm thinking maybe post-democracy might be a more useful, honest, and viable way to get out of the hell that Black communities are facing, particularly since fighting under the banner of democracy has brought us to where we are today. So on the first point, the hypervalorization of democracy, I start with Malcolm, great religious leader, Malcolm X, his critique of American democracy. What did he say in the Ballad of the Bullet, the '64 speech he gave in Cleveland the first time? He said that Black people have been, quote, victims of democracy, nothing but disguised hypocrisy, end quote. And Malcolm went on to explain that what he thought was best strategically was for Black folks to see America through the eyes of the victim and to view America as a particular kind of nightmare that is a democratic nightmare. And I think history bears out Malcolm's point for, and I'm sure we all agree on this, American democracy has never preserved and protected Black communities. In fact, and I'm extending Malcolm's logic here, the requisite institutions of America's so-called liberal constitutional democracy did not merely exclude Black people, but in fact, these institutions were historically organized against the flourishing of Black communities. This glaring fact explains the accumulation of trauma in Black communities now undergoing COVID, now dealing with Black death in different ways. At any rate, I don't want to go down that path because I only have 10 minutes. But when we think about what constitutes this liberal democratic constitutional America, right? Constitutional democracy. Most of us think of 3 areas, right? We think of our free elections, our well-established legal institutions, and our stable constitutions. Okay, sure. But when we look at our elections, the history of gerrymandering confirms that they've always been designed to proportionally silence Black communities and discount Black votes. As Juliet said, we're seeing this play out in Georgia right now, right? When we look at our laws, our courts, and our system of punishment in this country, the day-to-day experiences of Black folks under the coercive powers of the state in our Black neighborhoods and the hyper-incarceration of Black folks and others demonstrates the lack of integrity of our legal institutions, right? And if we look at the kind of constitutional rights to free speech and association, well, we wonder, okay, when we see cops in riot gear in Black communities, right, trying to squash, right, the energies of Black Lives Matters protesters, we say, wait a minute, you know, maybe these rights aren't guaranteed to certain communities and certain peoples, even when they're protesting peacefully. So what we have then is a kind of historically, I think, Melvin, anti-Black and exclusionary framework named democracy that gets obscured by an illusion, a narrative that we tell ourselves that imagines democratic projects can be inclusive. And we're told that democracy is on the way, that we have to fight for it. That it's a set of habits and beliefs, and we keep fighting. But my point is that even if we currently think of our elections, the Constitution, our legal system, our habits, as those are democratic institutions, but democratic habits, we have to acknowledge that the institutions themselves were organized against the flourishing of Black communities, right? That they never aim to protect those various citizens that we're talking about today when we raise the topic race and democracy, right? But maybe it goes further. Maybe they were designed to explicitly and intentionally, Juliet, destroy Black communities. So when we reframe democracy as an anti-Black project, I think it reveals that the institutions in this constitutional democracy have not so much been degraded or eroded currently, right? That is, the question isn't how could it be that our democratic institutions were so quickly hijacked by a charismatic figure from the outside who had no commitment to democracy? Well, no, when we frame this thing for what it is, an anti-racist project, it seems that this just exposes the project of democracy for what it actually is. That is the engine of elites who want to flourish under late capitalist democratic institutions. Now, let me calm down. My thoughts here are informed by somebody actually Bonnie introduced me to, political scientist James Martell, who said, democracy is a language of equality that always produces inequality. His work also raises the question of democratic trust for me, and not in the way that Mark Warren's 1999 text did, democratic trust, but it raises it in this way. Why should Black people trust that the descendants of people who stole them, who trapped them, who exploited them, and who killed them should be trusted as credible democratic interlocutors? Why, Melvin, should these habits that you're talking about, these beliefs you want us to hold, why should we embrace them given the history of these relationships that don't seem to generate trust? Now, sure, elections go on in America, but political debate and competition is managed by advertisers and marketers. Thus, it is little more than tightly controlled spectacle, in the words of scholar Colin Crouch. Sure, government does act these days, but as Sheldon Wolin writes, its actions easily collapse into economics, popular sovereignty collapses into consumerism, mutuality into mutual funds, and the democracy of citizens into shareholder democracy. So yes, we're told by our scholars and our leaders, and even by our neighbors, that democracy is always unfulfilled, that it's on its way, that it is not yet. We're led to think that its norms are constantly being hammered out in civic space, that they're being revised and reinterpreted for a public society, right? We're told that democracy is a set of habits, a set of beliefs that we carry, and we're instructed that this is the way of how we must relate to our fellow citizens. And this is what I think of as the kind of religious aspect of democratic belief. But this way of thinking about democracy, Melvin, you have to admit, is beginning to feel irresponsible and even quite dangerous. And this is what I mean by the hypervalorization of democracy. When the term democracy serves the same role for globalized neoliberal and neo-fascist elites as the term civilization once played for colonial endeavors of imperialist capitalism. This triumphalist logic of democracy is troubling, particularly for Black folks, because it takes us away from looking at how this actually existing democracy, not its habits, how the structures of this democracy are functioning to do harm to our people. All right, I'm gonna close, and this is my second point. What do we do here? So in many ways, we can think of this moment in the US political culture as unique, I think, right? Revolutionary politics and possibilities for new community formation seem to be opening up to us, right? Some of us would rather think of this moment as a post-democratic moment. because we tend to believe that considering it in this way allows fresh outlooks, new insights, and innovative sources of inspiration. It gives us a new psychic starting point, and it extricates us from the kind of, slave-linked, right, overlaps between democracy and progress, right? Because Black people always have to push against this, operating under the banner of democracy, right? And that's kind of a trap, right? And there's so many failures under the democratic banner that we want to push away from it. So this growing discussion of the idea of post-democracy is best thought of as an effort to conceptually grasp and critically mark the modern pathologies of liberal democracy, especially in relation to late capitalist conditions, right? And these kinds of discussions of post-democracy are found in the work of folks like Colin Crouch, Sheldon Wolin, Jacques Rancière, Jürgen Habermas, and many others, right? James Martell, who I discussed earlier. Now, of course, and I hear the criticisms, I'm troubled by the idea of post as it surfaces in many discourses, post-secularism, post-structuralism. We can go on and on. In certain instances, the prefix post can be read as suggesting a sense of a strong linear movement to history and a powerful teleological motion, which tend to confuse my point rather than clarify it. But if, however, and this is what I want to argue, what we mean by post is against, that is, what we mean by post is a way of standing counter to democracy, then we might be kind of thinking of the most well-developed notions of post-democracy, right? Like we have in post-colonial, right? So then the term post-democracy appeals to as a way of capturing what Malcolm was saying at the beginning, right? That Black people have been, quote, the victims of democracy, nothing but disguised hypocrisy, end quote. So I want to marshal, once again, the words of political theorist James Martell, thanks to Bonnie again, to support my thinking about post-democracy in this way. So Martell writes, quote, if we are dissatisfied with the workings of our contemporary democracy, perhaps the notion of post-democracy might help us think about a different way to order ourselves, right? So to use the term post-democracy to signify the active relationship between African-American communities and the US nation state is to want to understand Black life as a mode of creativity, a political aliveness in the face of a perpetual democratic assault on Black communities. It is thus to recognize that the Black imagination is persistently at work for Black wholeness in community that must work against the coercive powers of liberal constitutional US democracy, not with them. I'll close here. My hope is that a global post-democratic movement can build communities for just forms of freedom that not only counter democratic backsliding, but transform global politics so that marginalized communities can create conditions that meet their needs and the needs of all peoples. Thank you. I'm sorry to go too long.
Thank you. I've also been collecting some questions, but I have a feeling that since you took on your co-panelists, that people might want to respond directly to begin with to each other. Maybe I can just add a question to the list that we might consider as we talk, as we get the conversation started. I heard in Juliette's comments to us today an embrace of a kind of radical reconstruction of existing institutions and an unblinking, look at the current institutional formations limitations as far as real inequality is concerned. I heard in what Melvin Rogers was talking about today, an insistence on front-loading care and concern in whatever we do and however we take it on, a kind of commitment to an ethics of equality without which any innovation or any remediation will go lost. And also an insistence on the importance of genre in terms of how we think about it. Tragedy and romance are the two dominant tropes that we have, tragedy being part of the mourning of democracy that Juliette was also talking about. And along the way, Melvin mentioned another genre, actually, which is horror, and how that might be the appropriate genre for a certain period of American history, and what does it take to break out of that? What plays with romance is sort of the partner to tragedy, what would be the partner to horror that might be slightly better? And then I heard you, Andre, talking about how we need to let go of the thing we think we crave because it's the ship that's going to sink us, and there's no way to sort of repair the hole so that it takes us anywhere we want to go. So I took you to be the most finding the possibilities of democracy the least attractive or possible for any kind of future remediation, or dare I say progress, without buying into the whole progress ideology that you're talking about. So this is how I hear some points of convergence, but also points of great divergence among the three of you, which I personally find the most prompting of further reflection. So I'm grateful for the friction, which I think generates heat and light after all. So does anyone want to, I have a couple of questions of my own. We have some questions in the queue as well, but does anyone want to start right now to extend the conversation a little bit amongst the three of you before we turn to further questions? And if I got anything wrong in that summary, please just go ahead and, take your talk back. But I was just hoping to sort of serve it up in case anyone came in late.
I thought that was brilliant. Thank you for that recap. You helped me understand what I was doing better.
So Melvin or Juliette to Andre, maybe? So I'm happy to jump in with a very specific question, one of mine actually that's been on my mind, and then I'm going to go to audience questions, and maybe you can develop your responses to each other in the context of those questions as well. One of the things that I've been really struck by since the election on the long road to certification was how much focus there was on ordinary people doing the ordinary work of democracy, not the heroic, tragic figures, not great romantic figures, not sufferers of horror, just ordinary people of different races in different counties, counting the votes, withstanding all kinds of political pressures around them. And what's also been very striking to me has been the resuscitation around this work, this democratic work, of a kind of old script, a kind of post-World War II script about the dignity of work and how there's a kind of dignity to be doing this work in the face of all of this opposition. So people who've been defending, like I watched, for example, in Michigan, when they had an open hearing about certification, I watched how people called in and made claims about their experience of being at the polls and described poll workers in terms that are very similar to older Rosie the Riveter kinds of dignity of work templates that we have within American democracy. And what was interesting to me, and maybe, I think in a way this is a challenge in different ways for all of you, what was interesting to me about that was through a kind of metonymic transference, it wasn't just about the individual dignity of the work, which is old script, right? How you learn your humanness and dignity through work, which is the old 1940s script. But that democracy acquired a kind of dignity through transference from the willingness of individuals to do its work. And it has this, democracy is like any system of rule, it relies on great actions and on quotidian fidelities to its maintenance. So I just wondered what you think about that, about how, speaking of post-democracy, where, people also say we're kind of in a post-work era where most of the work we do isn't very tactile. It doesn't involve that many things. We're somewhere between, you know, internet and care, but the great middle in between those is fast disappearing. And yet somehow in the throes of the election, this old idea of manipulation in the good sense, putting your hands on things, counting them, organizing them, all became part of what it meant to be democratic. And it acquired a kind of materiality and dignity that I had not heard before. And also, this goes also to both Melvin and Juliet, it acquired that because there was a resistance to it. So these great ideas that come into being not born whole, but through resistance and contestation, like this idea of the materiality of democracy, it's there. We became aware of it, partly because it became an object of contestation, because there were poll watchers trying to stop the count, because there were people protesting the election and so on and so forth. So all of that is just by way of asking, you know, whether any of you were struck by that and whether you think it fits or doesn't fit the kind of interventions that you were putting together for us today.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I think you pitched it to me initially. So I would say, yeah, I like that. You know, I've been talking with folks who are organizing voting registration campaigns. Now moved to Georgia, of course. One of them called Georgia Stand Up, and the other was called Bull City Voting, right? And you know, it seems to me very clear, like what you're saying. Yeah, there is a way in which, you know, the contestation and the work in response to that really is a kind of, has become a venue for the development of a kind of ethical, or maybe it's a space to form a kind of ethical character, right? So that is, I think, this idea that, you know, one goes out and spends time, you know, diligent time that one doesn't have, working hard to sign up other citizens to participate in a process that I would say is sort of a dead end process, but we'll hold off on that point, right? Is a space that people derive great meaning and purpose from in this particular moment. Like I see that on the ground very much so. So I think that's a generative upside of activism across the board though, right? But my point is, right, to say that, well, you know, sure, but what is the end and aim of one's actions here? And at their best, right, if, you know, this voting thing is successful, which for some people it was, right, at least at the federal level, then what do we have? Is it really a transformation? I mean, I'll quote my 93-year-old mom on this, who will say, look, I'm not sleeping any better. I mean.
So I think that's a great point of convergence actually among you, even though there's this great divergence in terms of what might yet be possible. It certainly sounded to me like all three of the panelists were saying that, you know, if you're thinking about this from the vantage point of race, you know, there's still this division in which some people are not living in a democratic state and others are claiming they are. So did Juliet or Melvin, did you want to speak to that at all?
So I think I've just been sitting here thinking about, I know we have a large audience here, but I've been thinking about Juliet and Andre's presentation especially. And, you know, it's, if I can, you know, I can't see people's faces, I only see our group here, but if I can just, if we can just for a moment be family, where I could just sort of say some things to you and just be honest about some things. I mean, it seems to me, you know, or let me say it differently, you know, it's very difficult to be the subject of the thing that you're commenting on. By that, I mean belonging to, right, that class of persons that are on the short end of the stick when it comes to democracy. But I want to just sort of point out something about Andre's presentation, a framework that is sort of designed to sort of destroy Black folks, a framework that is, as he says, we have to see it for what it is. One of the things I just want to point out to people is that this freezing mechanism, and that's what it is, a freezing move. It basically freezes in place those who are taken to be the sort of the founders or the creators of the system, and it gives them priority in determining the trajectory of the system. But notice what happens here. Notice all of the folks that get excluded from this. Frederick Douglass, Fannie Lou, Martin Luther King, even Malcolm X, all of the Black and brown folks that have sort of struggled to make advances somehow don't count as moving the system forward, or they don't even count as redetermining what the system is, right? So, I just want to, in the 1850s, there was a debate between, I just want to go back in time for a moment. There was a debate, or I'm going to stage the debate between Frederick Douglass and Martin Delaney. And Delaney had a legitimate argument. He was like, look, you look around and what you see is enslavement and despair and death among Black folks. We need to go. And Frederick Douglass said, no, right? I refuse to concede ground. And when Frederick Douglass was basically saying that he refused to concede ground, he was claiming this as his, right? That is to say, he was claiming that Black folks have a share in constructing this society, right? So I can't accept. I just can't accept. And I hope you don't accept what Andre has put on the table. And the reason why we can't accept, at least Martin Delaney had a plan. Right, there was a plan for immigration. Andre has both told us that the system don't work, only to leave us here. There's no plan. And I want to just say back to Bonnie's point about activism, what do we do with the Black, brown, and white folks that were hitting the streets in the name of a democracy not yet? Is the suggestion that their work doesn't matter? Because for them, right, it was about putting some stuff on the table, right? It was about protecting one's family, right? They didn't have the luxury, right, of intellectual pontification about, oh, we just let it all go, right? So I just want to put that on the table, and I'm trying to sort of match the intensity with which Andre presented his point, only to match the intensity of the issues that are at stake.
So I'd like to jump in, ask Juliet, who has written on Douglass and has some thoughts about what exactly positioned him to be able to take the position he did. So I don't know if you want to talk about Douglass, but I'm inviting you in, Juliet, to the discussion.
Yeah, I actually, my response was not about Douglass, but I think it's to the general questions that and the ways in which we have been thinking in this discussion about what democracy is, and how, it's certainly interesting to think about what it is that Andre is rejecting when he talks about post-democracy, because I have also argued quite vehemently that Black people should not be doing the work of democratic repair in my own work, right? So I certainly don't see myself as somebody who's advocating that. But I think we need to distinguish between the institutions of democracy and the activities, the habits of democracy, right? The praxis of democracy. And here I think this isn't just, as I think is usually seen, because we want to co-opt those more organic, more individual, communal level practices to say this means democracy at the institutional level as a political structure is working, but rather because those habits and that work are important to the politics that these folks are trying to advance, right? So if I may be critical of the kind of infrastructure of democracy, and I am sympathetic to Andre's point, certainly, and I share it, I said it at the end, Black freedom dreams should not be limited to the project or constrained by the limits of democratic repair, right? They exceed that, and they should. But I do think that it is, so I think there are things that we're conflating, a number of different things that I think is important to keep separate. So, one of the things that I have found really and I think maybe my comments were responding to this, is to a sense of hopelessness in my students, a sense that nothing we does matter, a sense that there is no big change that can happen. There is nothing that we can do. And I feel like, you know, I don't want to constrain my, you know, my vision of what a more just, society in which we all can be free will look like to democracy. I don't know if, you know, but I do want to say, and I think there is a way in which we risk being, leaving people feeling paralyzed and feeling like if we cannot, right, enact fundamental transformation immediately, that means there's nothing that can be done. Part of my comments at the end about, you know, the struggle for the abolition of slavery, the struggle for civil rights, is to make the case that none of these things would have happened if we waited until, you know, 90 or 100% of people in the United States thought those things were a good idea. That's not how political change happens. And it's not how great transformation happens. So in part, you know, and I think Angela Davis has said this, you know, and she's experiencing a really interesting moment, right, as somebody who's been advocating prison abolition when she was, you know, she and many other, you know, people of color were making these kinds of claims at a time when they weren't being heard, you know, 20, 30 years ago. And she makes this claim about how we do the work now, and we may not see the fruit ourselves, but we do it because it has to be done. Mm-hmm. And because maybe that means we leave a legacy for those who come behind us that will make more possible. And so I think that's where I wanted to come in terms of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Honey, can I just jump in real quick though? Because I know we have a lot of questions from the audience, I'm imagining.
Yes.
I do want this to be on record, because if we were together, this would all be clearer. But I want folks to know that I love Melvin L. Rogers. That is my brother. I would take a bullet for that man. Like, that's my dude. I've known him for a long time, and I love him like my brother. So, you know, we would debate on this forever, I imagine. I can respond to his main points, but if you have questions, I won't do that. So we want the audience to get involved.
I'm going to give you all a chance to say something at the end, in addition to responding to audience questions on the way. So if that's okay, I think it's really enough to hear that declaration of brotherhood, I think, for the moment. Thank you. So I think one of the questions that we've had, it's a very different kind of question, but I think our audience questions seem to me to be split between people who are very interested to get specific practical advice about things to do, and people who are wondering, you know, what could we be dreaming of instead? How does dreaming happen? What would a post-democratic or post this particular iteration of the Republic come to look like? And so with that in mind, I'll just give you one of the questions that's quite specific, and you can certainly have the other dreaming question in the background as you think about it. This is from a Brown alum who's asking, what should be the Biden administration's #1 priority when it comes to addressing institutional racism in America? And while you're thinking about that, I'll also just mention that someone in the chat also said that they had not heard the term Jane Crow before, and they took that maybe as an invitation to ask you, Melvin, but also the others, what you think specifically we should be thinking about in the context of institutional racism that has to do with gender inequality as well. So does anyone want to think about or out loud about the #1 priority of a Biden administration in our current situation in terms of addressing structural racism or institutional racism? Any hopes or dreams? If they could do anything, what would you want it to be? Think about it that way.
So I would say that I think two things need to sort of happen. I mean, for me, I think two things need to happen simultaneously. The first is that the issue of reparations needs to be reignited, because that goes directly to the problems of economic inequality, and it doesn't appear to be the case that Black and brown folks can actually catch up, given the sort of structural setups of both our political and economic institutions. But to ensure that Americans don't easily slide, and Bonnie, here I'm going to take one of your ideas, but to ensure that Americans don't easily slide into the idea that reparations is a one and done deal, we also need, they need to establish at the federal level a Truth and Reckoning Commission. Bonnie, this is your idea, but it is an idea in which we have to sort of grapple collectively as a community. And it would be established federally, but it needs to be sort of dispersed across states and various communities, in which people can come and sort of reckon with the past of racial injustice and the way in which it bleeds into the present. And by doing these two things simultaneously, the second of these things is meant to discipline our sense of the first, that reparations is not a one and done deal.
Thank you. I might also say that the reason I call it Truth and Reckoning and not reconciliation is for reasons that have to do with the hesitations expressed and criticisms by both Andre and Juliette today, as well as what you just said, Melvin, which is that reconciliation is a bar that assumes that where we are is pretty good, but we just all have to meet on its common ground. Whereas reckoning is a little more open-ended in terms of where that process might take us. There have been several questions about the postness of post-democracy, and also about what it might mean to think democracy globally, when in fact we are still very much in the habit of thinking about the US as part of the West versus the rest. So I hear in these questions in the Q&A invitations to both Andre and Juliette, because you've written about the hemispheric dimensions of democratic dreaming, that break out of that West versus the rest idea. But if we're thinking about how American democracy is really sort of in the clutch of a certain set of institutions and habits and practices, it's also arguably, from the questions in the chat, in the clutch of certain geopolitical formations and habits and divisions as well. So do you guys have anything to say to think out loud about how we can deal with that? And what democracy could look like if it was not in the clutch of those geopolitical formations or geographic divisions or imaginaries? Juliette, you're nodding, or Andre, are you
Well,
ready?
I have thoughts on the sort of comparative question. I'll leave the sketching post-democracy is okay. Going to be Andre's. So one of the things two things on that. One is that I think something that the pandemic and climate disaster have revealed is that we're all in one pod, and that pod is humanity, right? That there is no longer a kind of sense that we are disconnected or within nation states, or even, as much as there is division, right, in the United States, the reality is that the problems that we're facing, the problems around things like coronavirus, this pandemic, the problems around climate disaster are, I think, showing the need to precisely look beyond this kind of the nation state and to think more globally. So in that sense, I think we are in a moment where we're answering some of the pressing problems is requiring us to think more broadly about, and there are, historical moments in the past where people have had these kinds of, sense of how do we think about, if you think about Du Bois, for example, and you know, the Afro-Asian alliances of the early 20th century, and this kind of vision of what, you know, a kind of post-colonial, solidarity of the global South might look like. So I think that there are resources in the past where people have tried to think globally also about some of these questions. And I also think it's actually an interesting moment for the US, I think, to maybe abandon some of this really problematic US exceptionalism. I mean, if anything has been revealed by, you know, the last, you know, by 2020, by the last 4 years, is that this sort of narrative of US democracy as being somehow, you know, kind of the gold standard, it has shown itself to be as fragile as the countries that we consider to be, in fact, much less democratic than our own. And that, instead of being cause for despair, I think is an opportunity to see ourselves with more humility and to say, what can we learn from others that we thought, you know, had something to learn from us? So I'm thinking here about the fact that in Chile, right, they just passed, agreed on a referendum to reform their constitution, right? And that is opening the, now we don't know, of course, this is just a referendum to change the constitution. We don't know what that new constitution will look like, but I think it's a moment for thinking, how might we learn from these other countries and their way, the ways in which they're experimenting, you know, with democracy, or with rethinking, you know, the ways in which they've organized their political community in ways that might be useful for the United States right now.
Okay, that was great, thank you. And I'll just mention that I've just realized the time, and so we only have 7 minutes left. So, and I had wanted to give you an opportunity, each of you, to say final thoughts. So Andre, I'm wondering if I can ask you to do a twofer right now and maybe respond in the way that you wanted to, but also weave in any final thoughts, and then I'll give just a minute or two to each of the others. Unless, Juliet, you want to call that your final thought, totally your call. But we need to kind of move in that direction. I apologize. I was mesmerized, so I lost track of time. Andre?
Oh, no, thank you. You appreciate your kindness and your moderation here. So just to the question about post, I think you said before Juliet went, there, part of that question was about the post and post-democracy. I tried to say that I'm wary of any kind of the notions of post when they're deployed to kind of suggest a kind of clear linear historical progression. I've read too much Nietzsche and Foucault to not remember that disruption, discontinuity, fracture, and repetition are crucial features of history, and that kind of opposition and struggle are important. So I don't want to uncritically deploy the prefix post, because that would undermine, right, the kind of insights that I want to bring in from both the fields of religious studies, but also my sense of history. Anyway, so yes, but when post is used not in such a flat-footed way, I think it can be useful. And that's why I try to suggest a non-linear conception of post, maybe a post as a counter, as an against, as an opposition. So that would be the starting point for post for me. Now, in terms of what did you say? Oh, final thoughts. I guess I would just go back real quick to Melvin and just say, one, you know, it's not the kind of freezing that he suggested that I was doing, right? So that I'm freezing this with the kind of originalists interpretation of the Constitution or something that no, I'm sensitive to. And these 10 minutes came out of a longer book project, right, where I do lay out, right, the historical progress that has been made under the banner of democracy by the various figures that Melvin cited, and that we share great respect and admiration for. My point, though, at this point is that after all of that, for Melvin, it's not that I want to hold off those accomplishments, but I want to say to what end. And so that is, Melvin, I want to bring in, you know, these contemporary conditions and look at what is actually going on, the actual thing of democratic, so-called democratic America, right? And say where we are and say maybe we need to conceive of this thing differently. The other thing he said that I have to respond to is he said those in the streets are we diminishing those in the streets who are working for a democracy which is not yet? So look, I mean, like, remember, I gave, in service of this university, I responded, I served on a panel after the election, I gave the convocation, I gave a March talk, faculty forum talk, where I did the very thing you're talking about. I talked about folks being in the street voting for hours out in front of my house in the rain, folks of color, right, as a way of elevating, right, the kind of activism that, Bonnie, you mentioned in your first point. So I'm not diminishing those who are in the street working for a democracy that's not yet. I'm actually elevating them and saying, how can I best conceptualize our work so that their efforts are not going to result in getting them the zero results that democracy has given them thus far? So I'll shut up there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Andre. Melvin?
Yeah, so a very quick point. So in
just a couple of minutes, I'm afraid. I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. So in the talk, as you know, I wasn't really trying to advance an affirmative position. I was just trying to describe what we seem to be oscillating between historically. And at the base of all of that is really sort of this final recognition. And I borrow it from Cornel West. We just don't know how to let pieces of ourselves die. We just don't know how to let pieces of ourselves die in the service of something better. And so arguments about sort of reconstructing or reimagining the Constitution, which I support, arguments about getting rid of the Electoral College, arguments about dealing with capitalism, all of those turn on our willingness to let portions of ourselves go. And here I will join Andre in the sense that I worry that the demand, and here I'm now going to use democracy, the demand that democracy actually places on us to satisfy justice might well be too great for the habits that we have cultivated thus far.
Thank you. Thank you, Melvin. Juliet, a final minute from you, please.
So one thing that I want to say is we haven't said much about gender and sexuality so far, and about, feminist, accounts of democracy. So I just want to say that I think that that's something that we need to think about. And I know that many of us do that in our work, but fair saying. And I think I want to end by saying something along the lines of what that picks up on Melvin's point, which is to say that the work of democracy is all our work. And I think that particularly when it comes to questions of race and democracy, we have too often, assumed that work is the work of Black people and people of color rather than all our work. And that at the same time, we will only ever make progress to the extent that we're willing to let go of our fears of what a genuine, if we do believe in that, what a genuine multiracial democracy might look like. And until we're prepared to live in that and to work for that, we're not going to have it, and it's not going to come about magically.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all three of you, and I'm just going to make 2 quick points by way of conclusion. And one is, I take what I learned today from listening to you all, is that if you live in a house that is in disrepair, and you spend all your time repairing what's broken in it, you never have an opportunity to step out of it and look at the house and ask if this is the house you want to live in. You're just too busy kind of holding the different broken parts together. You guys have mentioned gerrymandering, voter suppression, and all the other things that are sort of broken dimensions of democratic life in the US along race lines. And all of those things both need to be fixed, but we also need to not lose the desire to step outside the system and see if this is the system that is the right one. Is it the one we would dream of if we could find a way to dream? In Juliette Hooker's felicitous phrasing. I also think it's worth noting, it's been in everything everyone said, that democracy is by definition a system of majority rule. When majorities shift, the people who used to be the majority see themselves to be losing power, and they may decide that they would rather retain power than retain democracy because they were in it for the power to begin with. And so as People start to feel that whiteness is no longer the carrier of the majority identity in the United States. The move may be to abandon democracy, just like once upon a time they abandoned cities when they thought that suddenly cities were places for people of color, and so white people left that. So this may be one of those things, one of those many, many, many things that white majorities have left behind as they started to feel like they were getting infiltrated, multiculturalized, and so on and so forth. We all know from everything you guys have said that change doesn't come without resistance. And that means that resistance to the project of a truly multicultural and multiracial democracy is, if anything, in a way, a good sign, because maybe change is coming. So the last thing I'd like to say is that I want to conclude today by thanking everyone who made this event possible. First and foremost, the three of you who took time out to prepare such really interesting comments, and also to take the risk of friction and disagreement in order to produce illumination. It was fabulous. I want to thank the CSREA and the Provost's Office for conceptualizing the series. I want to thank Media Services and University Events for their skilled support. If it went smoothly, it's because of them. If it didn't, it's almost certainly because of me. And again, to our panelists for sharing this work and thought with us. As Provost Locke noted, it's essential that we at Brown and everywhere deepen our thinking on these issues. I want to thank everyone who attended for your questions, for your participation, for being here. And I want to close by saying, even though we've warned against it, let's keep doing the work and dreaming. Thank you very much.